Hey guys, tonight, we ride through the dust and wind of the Central Asian steppe. Your hands gripping the coarse leather reins of a Mongol courier horse, your breath frosting in the morning air. The sun is just cresting the horizon, and already your destination is 300 miles away. The note tucked into your belt, it carries the Khan's command. No pressure. Somewhere behind you, the empire stretches from the frozen forests of Siberia to the palm-lined shores of Persia, and every mile between is stitched together by a silent, thundering network of hooves. You're entering the world of the Mongol Postal system, a communication grid so effective it made medieval monarchs weep with envy. You've got a change of horses waiting every 30 miles, a badge that makes local officials hand you soup and shelter without question, and a delivery timetable so strict you could outrun most modern logistics apps. If your horse doesn't throw a shoe. But hey, you probably won't survive this anyway between wolves, robbers, and the occasional diplomatic fallout. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while we're at it, I'd love to know, where are you watching from and what time is it there right now? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a smoky yurt near Karakorum, the Mongol capital, as Genghis Khan leans over a rough-sketched map. It's the early 1200s, and the great Khan isn't satisfied with merely conquering cities and collecting tributes. He wants control over information. Messages must move as quickly as troops. Orders must reach generals faster than whispers. To do that, Genghis devises something that, at least for a time, might rival even FedEx: the yam. No, not the root vegetable. The yam, pronounced yam, is the name for the entire Mongol postal relay system. Think of it as the 13th century version of a mail and spy highway. It would eventually span thousands of miles, connect 4 continents, and run like clockwork, assuming you were the one holding the right medallion. The genius of it lies in its simplicity. Genghis places relay stations known as urtige, roughly 25 to 30 miles apart. Each one houses spare horses' supplies and often a sleeping mat or two. Riders swap out exhausted mounts for fresh ones and gallop on, barely stopping for breath. It's like a medieval version of a Formula One pit stop, but dustier and with more goat stew. And the couriers. These aren't random dudes with a backpack. They're elite riders chosen for endurance, loyalty, and a stomach that can handle 3 straight days in the saddle. Each carries a paiza, a metal medallion inscribed with Mongolian script, giving them imperial authority to requisition horses' food, shelter, and assistance wherever needed. It's the postal equivalent of flashing a badge that says, "Step aside, I've got mail from the Khan." It wasn't just letters they carried. Riders might be delivering grain inventory counts, battlefield updates, or diplomatic ultimatums, sometimes all in one satchel. And no one dares interfere. The punishments for slowing or harming a messenger range from terrifying to, well, let's just say you don't want to test them. Historians still argue whether Genghis modeled the system off earlier Chinese or Turkic relay systems, or whether it was his own brainstorm entirely. What's clear is that, like many things in Mongol governance, he didn't invent it so much as absorb it, improve it, and then crank it up to 11. The system grows fast. By the time of his grandson Kublai Khan, the yam boasts more than 1,400 relay stations and 50,000 horses. There are bridges, river crossings, guarded posts, and routes that snake through forests, deserts, and mountain passes. One Persian historian even marvels that a message may go 200 miles in a single day. That's faster than some medieval invasions moved. But it wasn't just about speed. The yam created a unified administrative artery across a fragmented empire. Through it flowed intelligence reports, census, data, grain quotas, and the kind of dry paperwork that makes historians' hearts flutter. Even poetry sometimes snuck in, carried by idle couriers with literary leanings. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some stations became semi-permanent communities. Locals married station keepers. Taverns sprang up nearby. Horses went missing and were mysteriously replaced by slightly shorter ones. Once a particularly eager inspector discovered a whole outpost had been turned into a kind of off-the-books Airbnb for travelers who lost their badges. Bureaucracy, it seems, always finds a way. Still, it wasn't all smooth galloping. Mongol officials often complained about the cost of feeding horses, paying riders, and maintaining infrastructure over such vast distances. There are records of stations running out of fodder or couriers getting stranded mid-route. One frustrated administrator even suggests replacing horses with camels in sandy regions, an idea historians now chuckle at, imagining camel relays that arrive 3 days late and chew the paperwork. Yet despite the hiccups, the yam became a foundation of Mongol governance. It's how news of rebellions reached the capital. It's how trade routes were monitored. And sometimes, it's how two lovers in distant provinces exchanged smuggled poetry. As you drift deeper into this dusty tale, picture yourself as one of those long-haul couriers galloping under stars, cloaks snapping in the wind eyes, scanning the steppe for wolves or way stations. You've got 40 more miles to ride. Your horse is sweating through the saddle blanket, and the missive at your side bears the crimson stamp of imperial urgency. No big deal. Just another night on the yam. You spot it on the horizon just as your horse begins to lather 3 squat wooden buildings behind a low windbreak of brush and half-collapsed fencing. A relay station. One of hundreds. You feel a surge of relief, though it's quickly followed by the dull anticipation of what comes next. No rest, no real pause, just a fresh horse, a gulp of cold tea, and another thudding ride into the distance. These places are called ortege, and they're the heartbeats of the Mongol Postal system. You might be picturing some medieval version of a drive-through, but no, these stations were surprisingly well equipped for their time. They weren't fancy, but they worked. Each one was positioned about a day's ride apart, roughly 25 to 30 miles. For a courier, that meant a predictable rhythm ride, swap horse, maybe gulp down dumplings, then ride again. What's inside a typical station? First off, the horses. Rows of them tied and snorting, already prepared with tack. Groomed, fed, and ready to run. A good station might keep 50 to 75 horses on hand, more during wartime. Then there are the supplies: dried meats, fermented mare's milk, arag if you're brave, and whatever vegetables could survive in the regional climate. Beds, sort of. Mats, if you're lucky. A hay pile if you're not. Some stations have guards. Others are manned by locals who were more or less volunteered by imperial decree to serve as caretakers. In theory, they were paid for their troubles. In practice, not always. One unlucky station manager in Bukhara wrote to his superior about a pack of bandits stealing 5 of his best mounts and all his dried turnips. There's no record of whether he got reimbursed. You clomp into the station, hand off your tired horse to a sleepy teenager with straw in his hair, flash your paiza badge to the caretaker, and bark the standard phrase, "For the Khan." That's usually enough. Even if you're grimy, your badge makes you royalty. Within minutes, they're leading you to a replacement horse, well-fed, impatient, and probably more awake than you are. This system, organized, replicable, brutally efficient, was unlike anything most of the known world had seen. Even in Song, China, which had its own relay system, there wasn't anything quite this sprawling. And while Persia and the Abbasid Caliphate had experimented with courier routes, nothing matched the Mongols for sheer volume, velocity, and coordination. And here's something delightful: these stations often stocked signal flags and smoke pots to help riders find them in bad weather. Imagine galloping through a foggy steppe, your face numb, and spotting a thin trail of white smoke curling up like a beacon. That's your sign: hot soup and cold reality await. The yam stations weren't just useful for messengers. They also served as temporary housing for Mongol nobles, military officials, and later foreign emissaries. If you were traveling under the protection of a paiza, you could theoretically ride from Beijing to the Caspian Sea and never once pitch a tent. Food, shelter, and horses would await you at every stop. But not everyone loved the system. Villagers near the stations were often conscripted to support them, providing hay meat fuel or manual labor. In some regions, the constant demands became such a burden that people fled their farms to avoid supporting the relay posts. One grumpy Mongol administrator called them necessary parasites. Charming. Still, the efficiency was legendary. A message could travel from Karakoram to the Yuan court in modern Beijing in just a few days faster, some argue, than the U.S. Pony Express 600 years later. It helped the Mongols administer taxes, deliver battlefield orders, and even summon entire armies at shocking speed. One scholarly debate that continues to this day is just how consistent the quality of these stations really was. Some researchers insist that the network was tightly maintained and professionally staffed. Others argue that standards varied wildly by region, with some stations becoming little more than hay barns, staffed by surly shepherds. As with many Mongol accomplishments, the answer is probably both. An oddball tidbit. Some stations reportedly kept carrier falcons not for mail delivery, but as emergency dinner. Imagine being so far out on the steppe that your last resort is to pluck your emergency hawk. As you prepare to ride again, you glance back at the little station. A kid waves holding your previous horse's reins. You don't wave back. You're too focused on the path ahead, where another 30 miles of rough terrain, biting wind, and the rhythmic clop of hooves await. You stuff a hunk of dried mutton in your cheek like a grim Mongol squirrel, adjust your saddle blanket, and nudge your new horse forward. Another stretch, another gallop, another heartbeat in the vast circulatory system of a growing empire. Out here, between stations, between breaths, time stretches thin. The empire pulses with information, and you are just one tired rider with the Khan's command in your satchel and 3 more stations to go before sunrise. The horse beneath you is fresh, maybe too fresh. It dances sideways as you try to urge it into a steady gallop, snorting clouds into the frigid morning air. You tighten your grip on the reins and lean forward. The letter in your satchel presses against your hip like a second heartbeat. Out here, you are not just a rider, you are the road, the message, the will of the Khan moving at speed. And it's not just your horse doing the work. It's the medallion hanging from your chest, a paiza, usually a sliver of gold or silver, inscribed with elegant Mongol script. Think of it as your all-access pass to the empire. With it, you can demand food, lodging, horses, and obedience from just about anyone. Waving it around is like flashing the medieval version of "I work for the boss's boss's boss." These medallions came in different ranks. A copper one meant you were important. A silver one meant very important. A gold one. That meant you were traveling on the Great Khan's personal business, and people better drop their dumplings to help you. Some high-level medallions even included commands for exact numbers of horses' rations and escorts to be provided. They were often carved with intimidating lines like, "By failing to aid the bearer, you betray the will of the Khan." Yikes. And they weren't just for couriers. Merchants, emissaries, spies, many traveled with paiza badges. But couriers used them most consistently and with the greatest authority. Lose yours and you might be stuck in the middle of the steppe, begging goat herders for directions and stale yak butter. Historians still debate how strictly the paiza system was enforced. Some think it was tightly regulated with registries and inspections. Others believe it was prone to abuse with fake medallions and overuse, leading to local resentment. One poor station keeper near Samarkand apparently complained that half the travelers with badges were drunk, and none knew how to read their own messages. Nevertheless, the concept worked. You, the courier, didn't just represent the mail, you represented the very machinery of empire. People fed you not because they liked you, they didn't, but because ignoring you might mean a furious Khan showing up 2 months later with a cavalry unit and a memory. Alongside the badge, you carry scrolls sealed in thick leather tubes. Most are written in classical Mongolian or Uyghur script, though Chinese, Arabic, and even Latin were used depending on the region. They are dry things, tax tallies, grain orders, troop movements. But they hum with the gravity of empires. A delay of even a day could mean disaster, a missed battle, a botched supply chain, a lost city. That's why speed was everything. Some sources claim couriers could travel over 200 miles in a day using relay stations. A single rider swapping horses every 30 miles could cover ground faster than entire armies could march. And remember, this is without GPS highways or even weather reports. Just muscle instinct and a semi-loyal horse. And occasionally, problems. You ride past the skeleton of a horse half buried in snow. Its tack is still on. Its rider presumably was less lucky. Bandits knew messengers often carried valuables, or at least horses worth stealing. Wolves didn't care what you were carrying. And sometimes the elements themselves turned cruel. A river flood once swallowed 3 entire stations along the Kurlan route. A courier's satchel was later found 60 miles downstream, tied shut and miraculously dry. The message inside a delayed grain order. Too late, as it turned out. The famine had already begun. Of course, sometimes the risks came from within. There are scattered stories, some true, some probably embroidered by storytellers, of rogue messengers altering messages, skipping stations, or selling imperial letters on the black market. One apocryphal tale tells of a disgruntled courier who swapped 2 messages. One, a declaration of war. The other, a birthday greeting. It did not go well. Even more strangely, some paiza were found buried in ceremonial graves. Scholars still argue over what this means. Were they honors given in death? Did couriers request to be buried with them out of pride? Or were they simply stolen and lost during battle or disaster? Regardless, that little medallion cool against your chest remains the most powerful object you carry. Not the letter, not the knife. That little sliver of inscribed authority is the difference between a warm fire at the next station and being turned away into the cold. The horse finally settles into its pace, hooves thudding like drums on the frozen earth. You tilt your head back and let the icy wind cut across your face. Somewhere out there, another rider gallops the opposite way, letter flapping, cloak flying. You'll never meet, but together, you form the nervous system of the world's largest land empire. Your paiza clinks softly as you shift in the saddle. It's a tiny sound, but it echoes louder than any war drum, at least to the villagers waiting to serve the messenger of the Khan. Your thighs are sore, your hands blistered, and the horizon refuses to come any closer. You've already changed horses twice today, but the miles keep stretching like old leather. Welcome to life as a Mongol courier, where the distances make modern delivery drivers look like pampered aristocrats in air-conditioned chariots. Let's talk about the distances you'd be expected to cover. On paper, a courier could knock out about 25 to 30 miles between relay stations in a few hours easy, right? But that's assuming the road is flat, the weather is mild, and your horse isn't secretly nursing an attitude problem. In practice, you're pushing past 100 miles a day. Some reports even boast 200 miles on an urgent run. That's not horseback riding, that's horse-based teleportation. To put it in modern terms, that's like riding from Paris to Brussels in a single day. Without GPS, without paved roads, and with wolves occasionally joining the fun. Mongol couriers were expected to do this daily, and to do it without excuses. And they weren't stopping for a latte along the way. Meals happened on horseback, usually dried meat, sour curds, or stale dumplings that could be chewed with one hand while holding reins with the other. Water. Whatever stream you could find, hopefully upstream of where the horses bathed. Sleep. You might squeeze in a nap at a station curled next to a stranger under a leaky roof with someone else's boots in your face. One chronicler described the life of a yam rider as the closest thing to death that still draws breath. Charming. But somehow they kept going. You pass landmarks that barely register, a tree shaped like a crooked finger, a rock with someone's initials, a patch of yellow grass you swear you've seen twice already. These little things become your mile markers. And over time, the distances start playing tricks. Some stretches feel endless. Others vanish in the rhythm of hooves and wind. Time folds in odd ways when you're riding with purpose, and exhaustion is your constant travel companion. Of course, the Mongols didn't invent the idea of relay riding. The Persian chapars and the Chinese Liu post had similar systems. But the scale was new. Under Genghis and his successors, the Yam expanded to cover almost 20,000 miles of track, connecting China, Central Asia, Persia, Russia, and parts of Eastern Europe. That's about twice the length of the Roman roads. It was a web woven across mountains, deserts, rivers, and forests, threaded not with stone, but with hoofprints. Historians still argue whether the postal routes were pre-marked with signs or simply memorized. Some suggest that paths were left deliberately unmarked to confuse enemies. Others think messengers used cairns fire signals or specific trees as guides. Either way, if you got lost, you'd better hope your next stop had stew, and someone patient enough to give directions in 3 languages. And yes, language was its own journey. Riders often had to carry messages written in unfamiliar scripts: Chinese, Uyghur, Arabic, even Syriac. You weren't expected to read them unless you were multilingual, which some riders were, but you did need to guard them with your life. One courier famously drowned rather than give up his satchel to invading troops. The letter was found intact days later, although whether it was ever delivered no one knows. Then there's the matter of terrain. Snowstorms in the Altai Mountains could bury entire relay stations. In the Gobi Desert, riders braved sandstorms so fierce they lost their own horses under drifting dunes. One traveler's account mentions that a rider once completed his route on foot, leading his collapsed horse the last 12 miles covered in sand and muttering curses about camels. And still, the system worked. At least most of the time. There are complaints in the UN records about lazy horses, drunken riders, and bandits dressed as couriers, but these were exceptions. Most messages arrived on time or as close as medieval timekeeping could measure. A quirky note: some riders reportedly carried small bells to alert station keepers of their arrival. Imagine hearing that distant tinkling at night like a ghostly ice cream cart charging through the dark. Other stations used lookout towers ready to spot riders from miles away and prepare the next horse like a NASCAR pit crew with oats instead of tires. And still the debate goes on. Did these couriers have to memorize their routes? Did they ride solo or in pairs? Were they allowed personal effects? You'll find pages and pages of scholarly speculation on everything from saddlebag weight to the digestibility of steppe cheese. But here's what we know for sure. They were fast, they were relentless, and they made the whole empire hum. You shift in your saddle and stretch your legs, barely noticing the ache anymore. A hawk circles overhead. Your horse snorts and tosses its head. There's another station on the horizon, maybe 20 minutes out if you push. And so you do. Because that's what you're here for. Not the comfort. Not the view. Just the miles. You reach the next station just as dusk begins to pull its velvet curtain across the steppe. The horses here are already restless. They sense your urgency before the caretakers even notice you. Dust cakes your boots and your lips are cracked from the wind. But you don't stop. You never really stop. One leg slings over the saddle, and within 5 minutes you're mounted again, a fresh mount beneath you, the same tired letter at your side. So what exactly are you carrying? Inside your satchel is more than parchment. It's a carefully bundled scroll wrapped in silk and sealed with thick, molded wax bearing the mark of a noble, a governor, or if you're really lucky, the Khan himself. The contents vary. Some are official decrees or tax notices. Others might be secret messages to generals or trade permissions stamped with a merchant guild's emblem. Then there are the stranger items. Coins, sketches, astronomical charts. A partial shopping list from a governor's wife has even turned up in the historical record, complete with complaints about a shipment of sour dried fish that insulted the gods. You ride with the equivalent of text messages, invoices, and diplomatic grenades, all bundled in leather tubes or lacquered wooden boxes. These containers are your lifeline. If one falls off your saddle and is lost to the steppe, you're likely finished literally. Failing to deliver imperial correspondence was considered treason in some cases. Punishments ranged from beatings to executions depending on the whim of the court and how badly the message was missed. No pressure. Yet despite the high stakes, messengers often got creative with their cargo. During long rides, some tucked small amulets or charms into the seams of their satchels, tokens of luck, protection, or sheer superstition. One preserved example even included a miniature clay sheep for good fortune tucked under a leather flap next to a military map. And it's not all state business. The yam system also carried private letters, especially once it reached its peak under Kublai Khan. A wealthy merchant in Samarkand might send word to his brother in Hangzhou about a grain shipment. A traveling monk might slip a coded message to a friend about suspicious movements near the western frontier. If you had the right connections or the right bribe, your message could travel the empire at imperial speed. The downside: you had no guarantee it would stay private. Many messages were intercepted, copied, or summarized for intelligence purposes. The Mongol state, ever fond of surveillance, routinely checked correspondence for signs of dissent, rebellion, or useful information. In fact, the yam functioned as an intelligence gathering tool, just as much as a delivery service. Historians still argue whether the system had a centralized censorship office, or whether individual governors decided what to intercept. Evidence suggests both happened. Some letters clearly show duplicate seals, meaning they were opened and resealed en route. Others have cryptic side notes scribbled in unfamiliar handwriting, like someone peeking over your shoulder and jotting comments in your diary. That brings us to the bags themselves. Most Mongol messengers used waterproofed leather satchels slung across their chest or tied behind the saddle. Some were lined with felt or wool to insulate delicate scrolls from the biting cold of the high plains. In wet regions, lacquered wood tubes provided added protection. Occasionally, iron containers were used for highly sensitive cargo, although they were heavy and tended to unbalance the horse if not carefully strapped. And then there were the oral messages. Yes, sometimes you carried nothing at all, just a memorized message sealed behind your teeth like a secret prayer. Trusted couriers were trained to recite entire decrees, poems, or negotiation terms word for word. There's one tale, probably apocryphal, of a rider who broke his leg and, unable to continue, dragged himself by his elbows for 3 days to deliver a single memorized sentence. Now that's commitment, or something bordering on terrifying devotion. Some yam couriers were multilingual, capable of translating messages on the fly or adjusting their pronunciation based on dialect. Imagine reciting tax demands in Mongolian, Persian, and Chinese in the same afternoon, all while trying not to swallow a bug at full gallop. It wasn't all official business, though. Occasionally you'd carry packages, small high-value items like jade, medicinal herbs, or letters sewn into fabric. One Spanish ambassador's report mentioned a Mongol rider carrying 3 pearls hidden inside a hollow reed. Another letter was written on silk so fine it could be rolled into a tube no wider than a chicken bone. Of course, there were misadventures. One rider reportedly dropped a message pouch into a river crossing and watched helplessly as it floated downstream. He was found 3 weeks later still walking along the riverbank, refusing to return until he'd retrieved the letter. The letter, for the record, had already been found by a fisherman who used it to patch a roof leak. You, however, are a professional, or at least you try to be. The scroll at your side is safe, your medallion secure, your horse reasonably obedient. The wind bites your cheeks and flaps your sleeves like impatient hands. Behind you, 1,000 hoofbeats echo in memory. Ahead, the world continues to widen. Another message delivered. Another 100 miles to go. The next station is smaller than the others, a crooked shack with a collapsed lean-to one-tether post, and a single horse that looks like it's considering early retirement. You dismount stiffly, bones cracking like dry twigs, and wave your paiza as you approach. An old man with 3 teeth and a heroic mustache squints at it, grunts, and beckons you in. This isn't luxury, but it's better than camping with wolves. The letter in your satchel stays tucked safely under your coat. This one's bound for a local administrator, a message about tribute collection or troop movements. He'll read it while chewing dried apricots, nod gravely, and hand it off to someone else. And someone else will file it or rewrite it or burn it depending on how their day is going. What's more fascinating is who doesn't get the message. Not everyone in the Mongol Empire had the right to receive or send mail. Access to the yam was tightly controlled, at least in theory. Messages could only be sent through official channels, usually by those with some measure of rank, wealth, or relevance. That meant nobles, governors, tax officials, military leaders, and of course, spies. Lots of spies. Ordinary citizens. Not so much. If you were a farmer with news of a cousin's wedding 2 valleys over, the yam wasn't for you. Unless your cousin was marrying the Khan's daughter, you were walking. That exclusivity gave the system both its power and its flaws. It allowed the Mongols to move critical information fast with minimal clutter. But it also created gaps, whole regions where voices went unheard, and problems simmered quietly until they exploded. Some Mongol rulers tried to expand the system. Kublai Khan, ever the administrator, extended yam access to select foreign envoys, merchants, and even traveling monks. But again, only if they had the right documents or enough silver to grease the station keepers' palms. Historians still argue about just how accessible the yam really was. Some scholars insist it was only for the elite. Others believe a wide swath of middle-tier officials and merchants had access, especially during the Pax Mongolica, when trade routes boomed and letters flew like arrows. The truth is probably somewhere in between. And that raises a juicy issue: forgery and fraud. The paiza badges that guaranteed access could be counterfeited. Over time, more and more people, some with questionable legitimacy, began flashing medallions and demanding service. This caused considerable strain on local populations who were required to house, feed, and outfit riders, often without compensation. One Chinese official in the Yuan dynasty bitterly complained that so many honored travelers were passing through his province that even the chickens have forgotten how to cluck from exhaustion. That's probably a metaphor. Probably. The burdens on local villages were real. While the empire funded the central logistics of the yam, the day-to-day operations often relied on corvée labor, that is, forced service from peasants and townsfolk. Villagers had to provide food, maintain the roads, repair bridges, and sometimes even donate horses. You can imagine how popular that made the couriers. There are tales of entire towns faking sickness or moving stations just to avoid the demands. One station keeper claimed all his horses had caught a mysterious hoof fever. Another simply vanished, leaving behind a sign that read in Mongolian script, "Gone to find better soup." It didn't help that some couriers took advantage of their status. Your badge gave you near total immunity, and some used that freedom to bully locals, steal supplies, or demand elaborate meals. A few even settled down at stations for weeks, claiming they were awaiting further orders, which somehow involved drinking everyone's fermented mare's milk. Still, not all stories are sour. Many station keepers took pride in their roles. Some turned their posts into community hubs, adding gardens, prayer stones, or elaborate murals. One post near Lake Baikal was famous for its carved gate painted with galloping horses and dragons, a tribute to the spirit of movement itself. Foreign travelers occasionally left glowing reviews. Ibn Battuta, the Moroccan explorer, marveled at the yam's speed and efficiency, even if he did find the food a bit strange. "A letter may travel with more haste than an arrow," he wrote, sounding both impressed and vaguely offended. And of course, the system wasn't limited to land. In coastal regions, the Mongols adapted the yam to include boat-based routes. Letters were passed between riverboats or ferries with sailors standing in for horsemen. In Southeast Asia, one governor noted that a message can cross a sea quicker than a storm, which is either poetic or terrifying. Not every message arrived. Not every station stayed open, but the system endured. Like veins under the skin of empire, the yam pulsed with life. And you are one of its cells, galloping endlessly, unnoticed by history, but crucial to its breath. Your horse shifts impatiently beneath you. The old man squints at the horizon and nods. Time to go. One more station. One more message. One more ride through silence. Your next horse is a wiry little beast, half nerves, half lightning, and it bolts the moment your boots hit the stirrups. You don't bother trying to slow it. The faster you reach the next station, the better. The landscape blurs into streaks of gold and gray. You're racing not just across land but across systems of power and politics that stretch like taut strings from the court of the Khan to the farthest edge of the known world. By the time Kublai Khan ascended to power in the late 13th century, the yam had already grown into a monumental achievement. But Kublai, grandson of Genghis, governor turned emperor, horseman turned bureaucrat, wasn't content with fast and functional. No, he wanted fancier. Under his reign, the Mongol postal system was upgraded dramatically. Some relay stations became more like imperial inns with soft bedding, silk curtains, and full kitchens. Guests with the proper documents could enjoy banquets between horse changes. And there are records of stations in northern China, serving roasted duck and warm rice wine to passing dignitaries. You, however, get cold dumplings and maybe a half-cooked turnip. Depends on your rank. Kublai also brought in the heavy machinery of Chinese bureaucracy. That meant meticulous logs of mail routes, weight limits for cargo, and sometimes even receipts. The system began issuing tamga official seals stamped on documents and goods to verify their authenticity. Couriers were inspected more often. Horses were branded to prevent unauthorized swaps. Welcome to the paperwork revolution. And yet amid all this structure, the system still moved. The improvements helped stabilize regions that were teetering after conquest. They made trade safer, diplomacy smoother, and governance possible in a realm too vast to shout across. With one letter, a command could leave Beijing and arrive in Tabriz within weeks. That's like sending an email from Tokyo to Istanbul and getting a reply. Not surprisingly, this golden age of the yam didn't come cheap. The system required tens of thousands of relay horses. Estimates range from 50,000 to 200,000 across the empire depending on the decade. And those horses didn't just feed themselves. They needed fodder, water, rest, and occasionally persuasion not to roll over and die in the middle of a delivery. Some stations were even stocked with specialty animals for particular routes. Hardy ponies for mountain passes. Larger breeds for desert hauls. And in swampy regions, even mules or oxen. One station reportedly kept a trained elephant, though historians still argue whether that was for prestige delivery or someone's extremely misguided birthday party. The volume of mail also increased. Alongside state documents, the yam began ferrying diplomatic gifts, trade contracts, and sometimes entire bureaucrats. If a regional governor had to report to the capital, he could hop from station to station like a very grumpy backpacker, eating at every stop and grumbling about saddle chafing. Kublai's expansion also brought new layers of oversight. Each route had supervisors, often former couriers themselves, who were tasked with quality control. Did the riders follow protocol? Did the stations have fresh water? Were the horses properly rotated? Inspectors were known to pop in unannounced, sometimes pretending to be riders, just to test the system. This attention to detail gave the yam an eerie consistency across thousands of miles. Whether you were in the snowy forests of Siberia or the rice fields of southern China, you could expect to station a horse and a bowl of something hot and vaguely edible. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Of course, this also meant that corruption became more creative. Some inspectors were bribed to overlook shoddy stations. Others invented ghost horses that existed only on paper, but still drew feed money from the treasury. In one case, a courier was found transporting fermented fish instead of mail, using the system to run his side hustle. His punishment: forced to eat his profits. Still, these problems were relatively minor compared to the larger triumph of functional postal network stretching across more than a fifth of the globe, connecting dozens of cultures, languages, and landscapes. It allowed a merchant in Delhi to coordinate with a buyer in Bukhara. It let a general in the Caucasus request reinforcements from Beijing. It even gave poets the absurd privilege of sending flowery odes about moonlight and horses to lovers 800 miles away. A fringe theory among modern historians suggests that the yam was so effective, it may have inadvertently slowed innovation in other forms of communication. Why invest in pigeons, signals, or coded drums when you've got a guy with a badge, 4 horses, and a deadline? But there's something deeper here. Kublai's upgrades weren't just logistical, they were philosophical. They signaled a shift from the raw conquest of Genghis's day to a more refined administrated empire. From thunder to structure, from gallop to glide. And as you now glide across the frost-dusted plain, the sky bruising purple overhead, you realize that you're not just a rider anymore. You're part of a machine that hums with letters, hooves and voices, one that reaches from the Pacific coast to the Black Sea, and whispers the will of an empire across every whispering blade of grass. Your legs ache like old timber. The saddle has worn a groove in your soul. But you ride on because out here between the bones of grass and the lines of horizon someone is watching. Not the wind, not just the horses. Someone with a ledger. You arrive at a relay post just before dawn, your breath misting in the air, the sky bruised with the first hints of blue. As you swing down from the saddle, a man with ink-stained hands and eyes like burnt coals steps forward. He's not here to feed you or find your next horse, he's here to count. Welcome to the bureaucratic underbelly of the yam, the world of postal inspectors and horse counters. See, the Mongol Empire didn't just trust its messengers blindly. Every stretch of road, every relay post, every horse and oat bag was subject to inspection. The empire was a machine, yes, but even machines need oil, and oversight, and lots of yelling. These inspectors were part of the Ortok system, an administrative web woven across the empire to monitor everything from tax flows to grain shipments. Some were career bureaucrats. Others were former couriers promoted for loyalty and stamina, and perhaps the ability to stay awake through 2 days of goat-based accounting. Their job was simple: make sure the system worked and catch anyone pretending it did. They'd ride unannounced into stations, check the condition of horses, taste the food, inspect the roofs, and most importantly, verify the logs. Every post was supposed to record every rider, who they were when they arrived, where they were headed, what badge they carried, and whether they seemed suspiciously sweaty or suspiciously relaxed. Fail to keep the books up to date. That's a fine. Lose a horse. Bigger fine. Lie about it. Oh, now we're talking corporal punishment. One station keeper in Transoxiana claimed that an inspector once made him eat his own falsified logbook. Paper, it turns out, pairs terribly with fermented mare's milk. The logs also recorded horse use and rotation. No horse was supposed to make more than 2 consecutive legs in a day without rest. Overuse meant tired horses, which meant slower mail, which meant angry Khans. So inspectors literally counted hoof prints. If they suspected that a horse had galloped too far too fast, they could perform what might generously be called a sniff test, and less generously, an equine interrogation. Historians still argue over how strictly this was enforced. Some say it was a polite fiction, others that it was deadly serious. We know at least one inspector was executed for accepting bribes from station keepers who kept dead horses on their lists for years, collecting feed money for animals that were long since glue. And speaking of glue, no, they didn't make glue. Mongols revered horses too much for that. Even old nags were treated with a sort of rugged respect. But horse fraud was real. Swapping lean, fast horses for fat, lazy ones, or claiming sick horses so you didn't have to give your best steed to a sweaty courier. These tricks happened. Inspectors in theory stopped that. In practice, it depended on how much silver changed hands. There were also roaming audits where a team of inspectors would ride a portion of the yam undercover, posing as couriers, envoys, or even sick travelers to test the quality of service. If you failed to serve them well, you might find your post suspended, which in this case meant your supplies were cut, your horses confiscated, and your yurt relocated to the middle of nowhere. Of course, sometimes even the inspectors went rogue. One report from the Ilkhanate describes an inspector who faked entire stations for months, sending reports from fortified posts that turned out to be goat pens and painted rocks. He was eventually caught when he tried to submit his monthly grain bill and forgot that his fictional station had claimed to be underwater the previous season. You, the courier, knew all this, which is why every stop was a performance. You arrived sharp, showed your paiza, signed the log, thanked the station master in a tone that said, "I am both grateful and watching you," and moved on. You didn't want to be the reason an inspector opened an investigation. That usually ended with someone missing a tooth or a horse. And if you were an inspector, well, then you had your own problems. Like being despised by everyone, sleeping under saddles, and having to check if hay was being stolen by weighing the manure output of the horses. Yes, really. There's a record of one Yuan-era administrator instructing his subordinates to calculate hay theft by observing dung volume over time, a career low even by medieval standards. Still, their role kept the yam going. Without oversight, the stations would have crumbled. Horses would have been overworked, riders would have lingered, and the entire flow of empire would have jammed like a bad flute. Instead, you ride through a system that, for all its flaws, functions. It runs because someone is watching. Someone is counting. Someone is grumpily scribbling in a logbook by candlelight while chewing yesterday's bread and wondering how a horse can look so guilty. As you ride out again, your new mount snorting clouds into the morning air, you pass an inspector trudging on foot, eyes scanning the hoof prints, brush in hand. He glances up, nods, and keeps walking. You don't look back. You've got another 60 miles ahead and a letter from the governor to deliver. And besides, you're pretty sure your last horse may have been used one leg too many. The sky above you is pale and trembling, a sheet of dull metal stretched over the curve of the steppe. You ride without speaking, without thinking, just moving forward, guided by muscle memory, instinct, and that ever-present tug of duty. The wind bites your cheeks like a bored cat. You're tired, of course, but more than that, you're alert. Because in the Mongol Empire, not every message was meant to be seen. In fact, a lot of them weren't. Tonight, you're not just a courier, you're part of the Empire's intelligence network. Because the yam wasn't just about mail, it was also about secrets. Genghis Khan understood something that most medieval rulers didn't. Information is power, and power that travels quickly is unstoppable. So from its earliest days, the postal system doubled as a spy network. It carried reports from governors' notes, from undercover agents, and intelligence gathered by officials embedded across the empire. You, dear courier, are not a spy, but you're often carrying the whispers of one. Let's say a regional administrator suspects a rebellion. He sends a letter not just to the Khan, but also to a regional intelligence officer, noting who's gathering weapons, who's hosting strange guests, and who's mysteriously bought 300 shovels. You deliver that message, smile politely, and ride on. Later that week, someone else arrives in that same village and asks curious questions about shovels. Coincidence? Not really. Historians still argue over whether this spy function was formally codified or simply evolved naturally. Some believe the yam had a shadow hierarchy, an embedded layer of intelligence officers stationed across the relay system. Others think information gathering was delegated to trusted couriers and informants who just happened to pass through sensitive areas. There's no single answer. The Mongols loved layers. We do know that by the 1250s, there were entire units within the empire devoted to information control. These included court secretaries who collated incoming reports, coded messages using obscure dialects, or deliberately poor grammar to confuse interceptors, and even trained readers who could read a burned message by analyzing its ashes. Yes, that's probably exaggerated. But poetic, no. The dual use of the yam became even more apparent during military campaigns. Orders were sent via courier at lightning speed, but so were updates: who was defecting, who was hiding grain, who was delaying tribute. These messages let generals adapt on the fly, shifting troops and supplies faster than enemy forces could react. It was the 13th century version of battlefield broadband. And of course, surveillance wasn't just external. The Mongols were just as concerned with internal dissent. Letters between local governors and their subordinates could be intercepted by higher officials sealed again with duplicate wax, and passed along with a note that said in effect, "We're watching." Imagine sending your boss an email only to realize it's been BCC'd to HR legal and a guy with a sword. One recorded incident from the Yuan dynasty involves a courier caught carrying two versions of the same message, one official and one hidden inside a hollow scroll handle written in invisible ink made from onion juice. The courier, bless him, claimed he thought it was a love letter. He was reassigned to manure duty. Foreign envoys were also swept into this intelligence web. While their letters technically traveled under diplomatic protection, the Mongols were not above reading them anyway. Papal letters sent from Rome were reportedly copied and translated the moment they crossed into Mongol territory. One scholar even suggests the Khan responded to a European king before officially receiving his message. It wasn't all espionage and subterfuge, though. Sometimes information gathering was hilariously mundane. One scribe complained that his local yam office sent 3 identical reports on crop growth because the millet was just that exciting. Another courier was caught fabricating news to get attention, writing that a nearby lake had turned red overnight. Turns out someone had just dropped a crate of berries. Still, the yam's role in information flow, both public and private, was unparalleled for its time. It blurred the lines between postal service and surveillance, between statecraft and spycraft. And here's the twist: you're never quite sure which letter is which. You've carried orders to siege a city and birthday wishes from a Khan's niece, and both were sealed in the same wax, wrapped in the same silk, and delivered with the same gritted teeth. Once you transported what was supposedly a tribute list, but turned out to be a coded inventory of captured loot. You only knew because it rattled. So tonight, as you gallop past a frozen stream and hear wolves howling behind you, you wonder, is this scroll in your pouch just another letter? Or something more? Something someone else would kill to intercept? And still you ride. Because whatever it is, be it a military report, a marriage proposal, or a shopping list with political implications, you're the one who moves it. Quietly. Swiftly. Without comment. The courier is never supposed to ask. Just gallop. Just deliver. Just vanish. The next stretch is flat, deceptively flat. The kind of stretch that plays tricks on the eyes, making distant hills shimmer and horses twitch nervously at phantom sounds. You settle into a rhythm, but your mind drifts to a persistent question. How far have you really traveled? It sounds simple, doesn't it? But ask any 3 scholars to calculate the length of a Mongol mile, and you'll get 5 answers and a fistfight. The Mongols weren't terribly obsessed with standardized measurements, at least not in the way we are now. They had a unit called a tom, which some sources describe as the distance a horse could comfortably travel in a day. Others insist it meant the distance between relay stations. Still others suggest it was more like a fuzzy suggestion than a fixed number. Mongol measurements were, to put it gently, a vibe. What we do know is that distances were often measured by time and terrain rather than units. If a courier left at sunrise and arrived by the second goat milking, that was a good day. If he got stuck in a mudslide, well, maybe that wasn't officially recorded. Still, there were attempts at systematization, especially under the Yuan dynasty. Chinese scribes tried to apply their own standards to Mongol distances, resulting in some of the strangest maps in the historical record. One letter from a bureaucrat complains that a courier claimed to have traveled 50 li, but when measured by wheel, it was only 32. The courier's defense: the wind was strong and in my favor. Hard to argue with that. It gets even more complicated when you consider regional variations. In the flatter grasslands of Central Asia, a station might be spaced 30 miles apart. But in mountainous or swampy terrain, that could shrink to 10 or 15. This flexibility was a strength that allowed the system to adapt to geography, but it makes modern reconstructions a headache. Historians still argue whether the Mongols had a portable measuring device like a rudimentary odometer. One theory suggests they used counting drums, devices attached to carts that clicked every revolution of the wheel. But there's little concrete evidence. More likely they relied on local guides, seasoned riders, and a deeply ingrained sense of distance passed down from rider to rider. Another wrinkle. The unit of urgency. Sometimes distance wasn't measured in miles at all, but in how quickly something needed to arrive. A message marked urgent might skip stations, push horses past regulation limits, or even require relay messengers where each rider covered just one leg before passing it on at a sprint. Think of it as the medieval express service with a much higher risk of collapsing in the mud. You right now are doing it the hard way. You're riding solo, covering long stretches with only your wits, your paiza, and a saddlebag that smells like dried onions. You've crossed 100 Mongol miles already. But how many is that? In modern units, 70, 90, 120. Who knows? And even within the empire, debates over distance mattered. Military commanders needed to know how quickly reinforcements could arrive. Merchants wanted predictable delivery times. Even poets, those dramatic creatures, argued about whether a love letter sent by Yam would arrive before the moon changed phase. One wrote, "My heart gallops with the hooves of your courier. May it arrive before the snow melts." No word on whether the recipient appreciated the gesture or just asked for tea. Curiously, distance also had a political function. By exaggerating the reach of the Yam, Mongol leaders could intimidate rivals. We can send a message from the Yellow River to the Danube in less than a moon cycle, they'd boast. Was it true? Maybe. Under ideal conditions. If no horses threw shoes and no messengers threw tantrums, that kind of soft propaganda gave the Yam a mythical quality. It wasn't just a network, it was a promise. A thread binding the empire together, proof that the Khan's will could move faster than rebellion, faster than famine, faster than forgetfulness. And so, you ride, not quite knowing whether the station ahead is 15 miles or 27, whether this hill is halfway or just the beginning, whether your pace matches expectations or is being cursed by a log keeper somewhere with a red quill and a vendetta. Your horse begins to pant. The sun climbs higher. You squint into the light and see a bird circling in the distance, maybe over the next station, or maybe just mocking your sense of scale. But it doesn't matter. Because in the Mongol Empire, distance is not a number. It's a task. It's a test. It's the stretch of land between two obligations and the unspoken demand that you cross it again and again until the message is delivered. And so you spur your horse forward. One more leg, one more uncertain mile. You can feel the chill deep in your teeth now. The wind has shifted, carrying the kind of bite that doesn't come from just cold, it comes from sickness. Your horse is wheezing slightly, and you make a mental note to watch for swelling around the muzzle. Because in the Mongol postal system, if there was one thing more feared than wolves or bandits, it was a rider who sneezed. You've entered the era of the Black Death, and yes, even the Yam wasn't immune. As the 14th century rolled in, so did one of history's most infamous biological disasters. Bubonic plague, likely carried from Central Asia by fleas, hitching rides on rats' caravans, and possibly even unwitting couriers like yourself, began spreading across Eurasia with a speed that alarmed even the Mongols, which is saying something. They were used to moving fast. At first, no one knew what to call it. Letters mention the shaking sickness, the swelling death, and the silent smoke, depending on the region and the language. But they all describe the same thing. People dying quickly, sometimes overnight. Entire towns going quiet in the time it took a courier to ride from one station to the next. And the Yam, it kept running. Because you know priorities. Mongol authorities tried to adapt. In some areas, stations began posting flags to signal infection. White for clear, red for warning, black for turn around or die. Couriers were advised to avoid quarantined towns. Letters from plague zones were sometimes smoked over pine wood to cleanse them or wrapped in herbal poultices. No one was really sure how germs worked, but they had vibes and people acted accordingly. Historians still debate whether the Yam accelerated the plague's spread. Some argue it was a key vector, fast riders on borrowed horses zipping through infected zones and bringing fleas with them like tragic little souvenirs. Others point out that the very structure of the yam with isolated way stations and limited human contact may have helped contain outbreaks by keeping infected couriers away from cities. Again, the records are fuzzy and probably written by people wearing 3 layers of protective amulets. Still, there's no denying that fear crept into the system like a chill through a cracked door. Couriers began refusing certain routes. Stations were found abandoned supplies untouched. One letter from a supervisor to the Wan court in Dadu complained that messengers now fear the mail more than they fear war. Another suggested suspending the system in plague regions entirely, a suggestion that was politely ignored. You ride past a deserted village now. Windows boarded, no smoke rising from the huts. The kind of place that makes you feel like a ghost just for passing through. You hold your breath as if that will somehow protect you from whatever lingers in the wind. Even in these grim times, though, the Mongol system showed flashes of brilliance. Medical reports, such as they were compiled and sent along the yam. Information about symptoms, remedies, and survival rates moved across the empire almost as fast as the disease. In some cases, containment orders were issued from the Khan's court to remote regions in less than a week. That's impressive considering some parts of Europe wouldn't even agree the plague was real for another decade. There's a strange irony to all of this. The same system that unified the empire that made it so responsive may have been its greatest vulnerability when sickness struck. Centralization and speed are great until the thing you're carrying is a microscopic killer. Some riders tried to self-protect. They smeared garlic on their horses, tied blessed knots into their satchels, or wore layers of wool despite the heat. One Mongol courier reportedly carried a vial of goat blood blessed by a shaman which he swore had kept him alive through 6 infected zones. Then again, he also claimed he could talk to birds, so take that with a grain of fermented mare's milk. And what about the messages themselves? In plague years they changed. Fewer trade reports, more emergency orders, fewer poems, more inventories of lime pits and body carts. The tone of the empire shifted, and the letters you carried reflected that a kind of bureaucratic panic racing to outrun death. Of course you have no time to panic. You still have to deliver. Your horse still needs oats. Your satchel still has weight. The stations, those that haven't been boarded up, still await your knock on the post. The yam slowed. It buckled. But it didn't stop. And neither do you. The next station appears like a mirage, smoke curling from its chimney, a crooked fence surrounding half-frozen fodder bins, and a single bored horse nibbling at what might once have been hay. You dismount, stretch your legs, and knock on the frame with your paiza already in hand. The station keeper eyes you with a sigh that carries centuries of resentment. Because while you may have the badge, the letter, the saddle sores, and the call of empire behind you, he's the one footing the bill. You see, the yam didn't function without a quiet army of invisible participants. The villagers, herders, farmers, and local officials who were all in one way or another forced to support the empire's communication miracle. It worked like this. The central Mongol government provided the outline routes, broad supplies, horses to be stationed here and there. But the day-to-day burden of running a relay post that often fell on the shoulders of nearby communities. These stations didn't magically feed themselves, and horses didn't just show up freshly brushed. Each station required hay, water, firewood, saddle equipment, and food for the couriers. And someone had to chop that wood, grow that hay, cook that food, and not incidentally pay for it. Spoiler alert, it wasn't the couriers. Local households near a station were frequently assigned rotational duties required to donate supplies or send family members to help with upkeep. This system of unpaid or underpaid service is what scholars politely call corvée labor, and what station keepers probably called how I lost all my hair before age 40. There's a fantastic read tragic letter from a Chinese village elder to a Yuan official, in which he complains that during one winter, his community was asked to provide 17 bushels of barley, 12 sheep, and 2 healthy boys to the local yam station. They complied barely. The sheep survived. The boys got frostbite. And it wasn't just food. Roads needed to be cleared after storms. Bridges needed repairing. Guest quarters had to be cleaned after messengers came through with suspiciously muddy boots and a mysterious odor that might have once been cheese. In areas with lots of traffic, villagers basically served as part-time postal employees with none of the benefits and all of the grumbling. Historians still debate whether these burdens were evenly distributed. Some records suggest larger towns could negotiate their yam obligations trading goods or silver instead of labor. Others imply that poor or remote villages were hit harder, often left scrambling to meet quotas or facing harsh penalties when they failed. One outpost near the edge of the empire reportedly received 3 couriers in a single day, each demanding food and horses, none of whom tipped. In some cases, the stress broke people. There are stories of station keepers abandoning their posts and fleeing to the mountains pretending to be monks. One simply nailed his paiza to a tree and left a note. "Tell the Khan, I'm tired." But not every tale is grim. Some villages embraced the station as a community hub. Children would gather to watch the horses arrive. The smell of stew would lure curious neighbors, and a well-kept station could even gain prestige, especially if a noble passed through. One community in the western steppes became semi-famous for hosting a particularly well-dressed ambassador, and made a commemorative tapestry about it. The tapestry still exists. The ambassador's name, forgotten. Still, let's not sugarcoat things. Being adjacent to a yam station meant serving the state often without thanks. Your fields might be neglected because you're building stables. Your daughter's wedding might be postponed because the best cooking pot is being used to boil horse oats. And if a courier showed up and your only usable horse had already pulled a plow that morning, tough luck. Hand it over. Some station keepers did manage to eke out small comforts. Tips weren't officially allowed, but let's just say that a well-fed courier with extra coin might forget a bit of silver on the hearth. Likewise, minor goods, spices, wool, ink could be exchanged discreetly as long as no inspector was around to raise an eyebrow. It wasn't corruption. It was survival. And maybe a new pair of boots. By now you've eaten a few mouthfuls of tough bread and swapped your saddle onto a younger, springier mount. The station keeper mutters something about the wind and limps back into his house. You nod politely even though you're already thinking about the next leg. Because despite the cost to the locals, the system held. Fragile, underfed, occasionally insubordinate, but it held. The letters still moved. The empire still breathed. And you're the writer that keeps it going. You don't know the names of the people who fed you. They won't know yours either. But that exchange, that quiet, begrudging cooperation is what the yam was built on. You tighten the strap on your pouch and ride into the afternoon. Another village disappears behind you. Another letter waits at the end of the horizon. The wind has turned strange again, warmer, drier, carrying a scent you don't recognize. You ride past tufts of camel grass and low hills where hawks circle lazily overhead. The horses here look different, taller, broader in the chest, and somehow a little less annoyed by your presence. That's because you're not in Mongolia anymore. You've crossed into the lands of Persia where the yam still rides, but with a different accent. After the Mongols thundered through the Middle East in the 13th century, they didn't just burn cities and topple dynasties. They built too, at least when it came to administration. And one of the first things the Ilkhanate rulers did was copy the yam. Sort of. Welcome to the Persian edition of Mongol Mail, same horses, new spices. The Ilkhanate, established by Hulagu Khan, Genghis's grandson, ruled over modern-day Iran, Azerbaijan, parts of Iraq and Turkey. From the beginning, they recognized the genius of the postal relay system. A sprawling empire needed fast communication, and so the yam was re-established. Relay stations, paiza system, fresh horses, the whole package, just with more kebabs and fewer snowstorms. But here's the thing. Copying the yam wasn't easy. For one, Persia wasn't built like the Mongol steppe. The terrain was rugged, varied, and deeply urbanized in some areas. You had deserts, mountains, rivers, and cities that had been trading and writing letters since long before the Mongols learned to hold a pen. The result? a system that was less uniform and more interpretive. Some stations were converted caravanserais, old inns that served merchants on the Silk Road. Others were newly built relay posts that followed Mongol design, but struggled with inconsistent supplies. Riders often had to weave between ancient trade routes and newer, straighter roads laid out by Ilkhanate officials, who had probably never actually ridden them. Historians still argue whether the Persian yam was as effective as its eastern counterpart. Some sources praise its speed and coverage. Others describe it as a beautiful idea sabotaged by bad budgeting and regional bickering. One Ilkhanate courier wrote with impressive honesty that the horse was willing but the station keeper was drunk. What's clear is that the paiza system persisted. Riders carried medallions here too, though sometimes inscribed in Arabic or Persian, rather than Mongolian script. The same authority applied flash the badge, get the goods. Villages along the route were still required to offer food and shelter to couriers, though compliance varied. One particularly enterprising governor near Tabriz reportedly tried to charge riders for oats, claiming his province's horses were more delicate than the steppe breeds and required aromatic feed. That went over about as well as you'd expect. A royal inspector later noted that his station had mysteriously caught fire. Twice. You may also notice something else: the mail itself has changed. Persian administration loved paperwork, beautiful, elaborate, poetically phrased paperwork. Messages were longer, often more literary, and sometimes copied in triplicate. Some even came with tiny perfumed satchels or were written on dyed parchment. Very romantic. Very inefficient. There are records of Ilkhanate writers grumbling that a message of 2 sentences now arrives in 12 scrolls, and another complaining that a letter he carried for a royal bride included 6 stanzas about her eyelashes. And yet, the system moved. Letters from Tabriz could reach Baghdad in days. Diplomatic messages to the Mamluk Sultanate or the Byzantine court were often carried via this version of the yam. Even Marco Polo, while traveling through Persia, admired the relay stations and noted the efficiency of their operation, though he was clearly more interested in the kebabs. Like in Mongolia, however, the locals bore the weight of keeping the stations running. And here resentment simmered more visibly. Persia had a long tradition of centralized empires: Sassanids, Abbasids, Seljuks, and with that came a long memory. People remembered a time before being ordered to hand over their hay to a rider with a funny badge. Corruption crept in, as it tends to do. Stations recorded horses they didn't have, claimed supplies that never arrived, or simply lied about deliveries. One clever postmaster created an entire relay route on paper, drawing salaries and oat rations for 5 phantom stations. When inspectors finally visited, they found nothing but a goat and an apologetic boy who offered them cheese. Still, even with all the shortcuts, the Persian yam worked well enough to help the Ilkhanate manage rebellions, regulate trade, and conduct diplomacy with foreign powers. And when the plague hit, as it inevitably did, these routes also became arteries of both information and infection. Letters began to carry not just news but warnings. Do not enter the southern provinces, one dispatch reads. The air is spoiled and the markets are quiet as the grave. The letter itself was stained with something reddish. Let's hope it was pomegranate juice. You meanwhile are galloping past cypress trees and stone villages. The architecture has changed. The smells have changed. But the rhythm, the message ride, message heartbeat of the yam hasn't. You're not in Mongolia anymore. But you're still a courier. And the empire, no matter its accent, still depends on you to keep the silence from falling between its far-flung voices. Your new horse is tall, proud, and alarmingly aware that you are not its usual rider. It dances sideways as you climb aboard, clearly unimpressed by your credentials. But it's fast, very fast, and you're going to need that speed. Because this leg of your journey is more than a simple delivery. This one comes with a scroll tied in silk and stamped with an imperial seal as red as fire. And the person who once wrote about scrolls like this, Marco Polo, Venetian traveler, yarn spinner, and perhaps the Mongol Empire's most unexpected fanboy. You're now following in the hoofprints of a man who saw the yam at its peak and couldn't stop talking about it. According to his writings, Marco Polo was absolutely dazzled by the Mongol postal system. He traveled along it in the late 13th century, likely under the protection of a golden paiza granted by Kublai Khan himself. This badge gave him full access to the empire's vast relay network, which he described in terms bordering on romantic poetry. Stations so fine they would house a prince, he wrote, and horses fast enough to carry a message faster than an arrow. Calm down, Marco. Was he exaggerating? Probably. But also, not entirely. The Mongol relay stations during Kublai's reign were at their most luxurious. Marco claimed that in some places the stations included gardens, guards, and silk-covered bedding. Riders were served meat stews, hot tea, and fresh horses. He even described couriers wearing uniforms, though historians still argue whether that detail was reality or just Marco's flair for drama. And yes, there are fringe scholars who debate whether Marco Polo even made the trip at all. Some suggest he borrowed much of his tale from Persian and Chinese sources. Others argue the depth of his observations, especially on infrastructure, like the yam, point to first-hand experience. The jury, centuries later, is still out. But here's what everyone agrees on: his descriptions of the yam made Europeans' jaws drop. At the time, most of Europe's communication relied on wandering monks, hired runners, or pigeons with trust issues. When Polo talked about a system where a letter could travel 1,000 miles in a few days, people thought he was lying. Or mad. Or both. In one of his most famous passages, Marco describes 400,000 horses used for the postal system. Modern historians roll their eyes at that number. It's almost certainly an exaggeration, but it reveals the sheer scale and ambition of what he saw. Whether it was 40,000 or 400,000, the point remains, it was a lot of horses. He also describes the metal tablets, the paiza badges that served as imperial passports. These, he said, guaranteed safe passage, instant service, and the power to demand anything short of someone's firstborn. There's no doubt that when he returned to Venice clutching stories of couriers riding through snowstorms with flaming torches and imperial decrees, people listened. And perhaps they dreamed. Some European rulers did, in fact, try to imitate the Mongol system. By the 14th and 15th centuries, relay courier models popped up in parts of Italy, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, always on a smaller scale, always slower, and always with fewer dumplings. But the concept had arrived: the idea that a well-run empire could speak to itself across hundreds or thousands of miles in days instead of months. In that sense, Marco Polo wasn't just a tourist. He was a kind of cultural courier carrying the story of the yam back west. Even centuries later, his influence lingered. Early modern travelers referenced his accounts when charting their own paths across Asia. Postal historians, yes, that's a thing, still quote his work when tracing the development of global communication networks. And there's something charming, almost surreal, about imagining Marco Polo bumping along the same routes as you are now. Dust in his teeth, letter in his sleeve, grumbling about the quality of the saddle. It makes the Mongol world feel connected in a way that few empires ever managed. Now, as your own horse crests a small hill, and the next station comes into view, you wonder what Marco would have made of this moment. The wind in your ears, the letter in your satchel, the station ahead half mud, half miracle. Would he describe it as magnificent, glorious, or just dusty but efficient? Probably all three. You press your knees into your horse's flanks and ride on. Because fanboys come and go, but couriers keep the whole world talking. There's a myth that the Mongol postal system never failed. That every letter, no matter the weather or the war, arrived exactly when it was supposed to, like a divine whisper on horseback. Let's clear that up now. Sometimes it absolutely failed. And sometimes it failed in ways so gloriously ridiculous that you, the courier, had no choice but to shrug, remount, and try again with mud in your boots and a horse that's lost interest in life. This leg of the journey. Oh, this is the leg where everything goes wrong. You're barely 2 miles out from the last station when a herd of half-wild goats blocks your path. They're not moving. One of them stares at you with the confidence of a seasoned general. You try to go around. They follow. Congratulations, you now have an audience. Further along the road turns into something best described as liquid. A swollen stream has overflowed, turning the lowlands into a marsh. The bridge gone. Probably floating somewhere toward the Caspian Sea. You dismount, wade through knee-deep sludge, and wonder if messages of empire have ever smelled this bad. But the mail doesn't wait. Even in the face of minor chaos, Mongol couriers were expected to adapt. Lose your horse, borrow one. No station improvise. Fall ill. Wrap your scroll in oilcloth and keep moving. There were no excuses, just delays, and those had to be explained. In writing. To someone who never smiled. And those delays. Oh, they happened. One record from the Yuan court mentions a courier who was blown entirely off course by a sandstorm and ended up in the wrong province. Another involved a rider whose message bag was eaten by wolves. He escaped bruised and message-less, and was later tasked with delivering bricks instead. Safer cargo, they figured. Sometimes the mistakes weren't even your fault. A particularly ill-tempered station keeper once gave a courier a mule instead of a horse, claiming it was more stable on hills. The mule stopped every 20 steps to contemplate existence. The courier arrived 3 days late and immediately retired. There's even a record of a message being delivered to the wrong emperor. Somewhere in the shuffle between Persia and the Yuan court, a military order intended for one frontier got handed off to a different set of troops entirely. The resulting confusion caused a border skirmish, 3 resignations, and 1 official being reassigned to flood monitoring. Historians still argue whether that was an accident or sabotage. The Mongols were efficient, but not immune to office politics, especially when horses and reputations were involved. And then there are the missing letters, those never delivered, never recovered, simply swallowed by the great expanse of steppe desert or ambition. Some may still be out there, tucked into cave walls, buried in snow, resting under stone ruins with wax seals still intact. You wouldn't be the first to carry something that never reached its intended hands. And yet the failures weren't always disasters. In fact, they were expected. The sheer scale of the yam meant a certain margin of error was built in. The goal wasn't perfection, it was momentum. A steady rhythm of messages moving through the arteries of empire, even if 1 or 2 slipped through the cracks. That's why the system used redundancy. Important messages were sometimes copied and sent via multiple couriers along different routes. It wasn't unusual to have 3 or 4 identical scrolls galloping across the empire, just in case one rider fell off a cliff or got distracted by fermented milk and lost a day. There's even a quirky little note in one administrative record. If letter is not returned, trust the second. If the second fails, write another and blame the horse. You have to admire that logic. Failures aside, the system's resilience came from you, the courier. You didn't wait for perfect conditions. You didn't complain when your saddle broke or your soup was cold or the scroll pouch smelled like pickled garlic. You just rode. Through storms. Through goat herds. Through bureaucratic absurdity and muddy fords. Because somewhere a general is waiting. Or a governor. Or a merchant whose contract depends on the ink drying on the scroll in your pack. You reach the next station just after dusk, covered in mud with a horse that smells like a wet carpet and a letter stained at the edges. The station keeper eyes you warily, then shrugs and hands over a bowl of barley stew. No questions. No praise. Just another leg completed. Because in the Mongol postal system, glory wasn't in the ride. It was in the arrival, even if you were 3 hours late and trailing half a swamp behind you. The empire you serve is vast, a living, breathing giant that depends on every rider to keep its heart beating. But even giants stumble. The yam system that once thundered across the steppe and beyond did not last forever. You're now witnessing its slow fading, the quiet unraveling beneath the weight of time, neglect, and changing priorities. It begins subtly. Stations fall into disrepair. Horses grow scarce. Roads become overgrown with thorn and grass. The once sharp efficiency softens into something more casual. The tight discipline that made the Yam legendary loosens, and with it, the whole network begins to falter. Budget cuts hit hard. Imperial treasuries strained by endless wars and administrative expenses start to tighten the reins on postal funding. The vast herds of horses shrink, replaced by fewer, less hardy breeds. Some stations are merged, others simply closed. Official orders to maintain the routes often go ignored. Too expensive, mutters a provincial official. Rebellions and political instability complicate things further. In some regions, local warlords take control of relay posts, turning them into toll stations or worse. Couriers are stopped, searched, or robbed. Banditry resurges along once safe routes. The very infrastructure you relied on to navigate the empire becomes a maze of uncertainty. Even the bureaucrats grow weary. Records become spotty. Inspectors stop showing up. Some start falsifying logs to cover up the decline. One particularly frustrated administrator wrote in a letter, "The Yam is no longer the swift horse it once was. It's a tired donkey limping toward the sunset." Yet even amid decline, the system endures. Not with the thunder of hooves, but the soft shuffle of boots and the occasional neigh of a horse left behind. It's during this period that innovations from other cultures start to seep in. The Mongol postal system begins to share space with emerging European courier networks, Chinese official couriers, and Islamic caravan communications. Hybrid systems emerge, some stations experimenting with horses, others relying on camels or riverboats. The Yam becomes less of a single entity and more of a patchwork quilt. Scholars debate whether this gradual decline was inevitable or the result of specific political failures. Some argue that the empire's fragmentation made a unified postal system impossible. Others believe that economic shifts like the rise of maritime trade simply made land routes less critical. There's even a suggestion that the Mongol love of oral communication and personal messengers made some prefer the old ways over bureaucratic mail. For you, the courier, these changes are felt keenly. Some stations no longer have fresh horses. Supplies are erratic. Local populations are less cooperative, tired of endless demands with little reward. But you keep writing, because while the empire falters, the need to communicate remains. Whether in times of peace or chaos, messages must move. You pass a station where the gate hangs on one hinge and the hay is moldy. Inside, an old man smokes a pipe and shrugs when you ask for horses. He offers an ancient nag that looks like it remembers the reign of Genghis Khan himself. You mount and push on, the sun sinking low. The steppe stretches endless and indifferent. The empire is fading, but the road remains. And with it, your purpose. The Yam may slow, but it does not stop. The thunder of hooves echoes faintly in the distance, sharper now, the urgency palpable. You feel it in your bones, a message must reach its destination immediately. Because sometimes the fate of armies rests not on strategy alone, but on the speed of a single rider. Welcome to the world of battlefield dispatches, where the Yam wasn't just a postal system, but a military lifeline. As you charge along, imagine commanders in the field tents pitched in shifting dust, anxiously waiting for news from scouts, spies, and fellow generals. The difference between victory and disaster often hinged on the speed at which critical information traveled. The Mongol Empire, with its vast frontiers and rapid maneuvers, needed a communication system that could keep up with its armies. The Yam rose to that challenge. Riders dispatched urgent orders, troop movements, supply needs, and intelligence reports, sometimes in near real time by the standards of the era. A messenger could ride from one battlefront to another, faster than the enemy's own envoys, relaying orders that saved cities or redirected entire campaigns. Historians still argue how close to real-time these dispatches were. Some suggest commanders might receive updates within hours. Others say it was more like days. Regardless, it was far faster than traditional medieval communication. Your letter might carry a simple command, "Advance at dawn," or a complex report. Enemy forces mass near the river estimated at 5,000 cavalry. Reinforcements delayed. Request immediate support. Each word weighed heavily. There's a story probably true of a courier who rode through a storm, lost 2 horses, and stumbled into a besieged camp just as the enemy was preparing to break the lines. The message he delivered contained a counterattack plan that turned the tide. The general rewarded him with a new horse and a gold medallion. The courier, exhausted, accepted both, then promptly passed out in the dirt. Speed came with risks. Couriers sometimes rode through skirmishes, dodging arrows and sabers. Some were captured or killed. A few were rumored to have disguised themselves as enemy soldiers to slip through blockades. The honor of carrying battlefield news was high, and so was the price. It wasn't just military orders either. Battlefield dispatches could include logistics requests for food, weapons, medical supplies. Sometimes a courier carried the Khan's own orders to halt an advance, sparing lives but frustrating generals. These letters were sealed tightly, sometimes encoded, and entrusted only to the most reliable riders. And while the yam was effective, it wasn't foolproof. There are accounts of messages being delayed or lost due to enemy action, bad weather, or simple human error. One commander supposedly canceled a critical attack after receiving a false message, a mistake that cost lives and later became a cautionary tale. Still, the ability to send and receive battlefield information so quickly was revolutionary. It made Mongol armies more agile and responsive than their rivals. It was a key factor in their success across the Eurasian continent. As you ride into the fading light, clutching your message tightly, you realize your role is more than delivery. You are a link in a chain that holds armies together, that shapes the fate of kingdoms. Your horse snorts. Ahead, the campfires flicker like stars on earth. You gallop toward them. Because the empire demands it. Because the war never waits. The firelight flickers, casting shadows on faces weathered by travel and worry. You hand over your letter to the commander, whose eyes scan the carefully written words. This letter isn't just orders. It's royal gossip wrapped in the same wax seal, fluttering between politics and power like a dangerous kite. You see, the Mongol postal system wasn't only for official business. The same routes carried news of intrigue messages between the Khan and European kings, popes, and nobles. Some letters were dry and bureaucratic, others full of flattery, threats, or occasionally spelling errors that have amused historians for centuries. Remember when we talked about Marco Polo's letters? Well, those were just the tip of the iceberg. The Mongols corresponded with leaders as far west as the Pope in Rome. Some letters were diplomatic masterpieces full of grandiose titles and offers of friendship. Others read more like passive-aggressive emails with medieval flair. One famous letter from the Great Khan to Pope Innocent IV began with an elaborate title that roughly translates as "The Great Khan, mighty ruler of the universe, and defender of the faithful to the humble father of the Christian world." The Pope's reply, not surprisingly, politely asked the Khan to convert to Christianity, which didn't go over well. And let's not forget the spelling errors. One letter sent from a Mongol official to a European monarch was reportedly so riddled with linguistic quirks that the recipient believed it was a coded message from a secret society. Historians still chuckle at the phrase, "We will send you many horses, some with wings," likely a mistranslation or hopeful metaphor. These diplomatic letters were carried by couriers like you, wrapped carefully and often accompanied by gifts, silk, jewels, or even exotic animals. The yam ensured these missives crossed thousands of miles, navigating hostile territories and rival powers. But it wasn't always smooth. Some letters were intercepted or delayed by enemies or bandits. Others got lost in translation, literally, when scribes unfamiliar with foreign languages made errors. Occasionally, letters arrived months late, making urgent matters moot or sparking diplomatic confusion. Still, the mere existence of this communication web astonished Europeans and Asians alike. It allowed Mongol rulers to project influence far beyond their borders and engage in early forms of global diplomacy. The system connected cultures that previously would have been strangers, sometimes enemies, but now pen pals. One quirky example: a Mongol emissary once sent a letter describing the bizarre European custom of eating with forks. The recipient thought it was a joke or satire. Another letter from a European noble describes the Mongol court's fascination with women's hats that touch the sky, likely a reference to extravagant headdresses. Even the papal letters carried by the Yam reveal a fascinating blend of protocol misunderstanding and genuine curiosity. The papal court often included detailed instructions on how to treat Mongol envoys, advising respect but warning against their barbaric customs. So as you hand over this latest letter, a mix of threats, invitations, and friendly jabs, you're part of a centuries-old dance of words and power. Your role is simple, but vital. Keep the messages moving no matter the politics, no matter the language, no matter the jokes. You mount your horse again, feeling the weight of diplomacy in your saddlebag. Outside, the night deepens. Somewhere far away, another courier prepares for their own journey. You ride on. Because history isn't just written by kings, it's delivered by riders like you. The night settles around you thick and silent, but the shadows hold stories. As you press forward, you can almost hear the whispers, stories told around fires at relay stations long abandoned. Tales of restless spirits galloping alongside the living, of ghostly couriers doomed to ride the roads forever. Welcome to the realm of ghost posts and haunted relay huts, the Mongol postal system's more eerie legacy. The vastness of the steppe, the isolation of the stations, and the harshness of the elements created fertile ground for folklore and superstition. Riders who disappeared without a trace became legends. Stations where screams were heard after dark gained reputations as cursed places. And some couriers swore they saw shadowy figures racing beside them under the moonlight, silent, swift, and intangible. One common tale tells of a young rider who vanished near Lake Baikal during a harsh winter. Locals claim his spirit still patrols the shore, warning travelers of coming storms with a haunting whistle. Another story speaks of a relay hut where the fire never dies, yet no one lives there anymore. Historians aren't sure how many of these stories are based on real events and how many grew from the loneliness and danger of the job. But these legends reveal a human side to the Yam where fear and hope gallop together. A quirky detail: some stations placed talismanic stones or amulets to ward off spirits. Riders carried small charms in their packs, bone, leather, or carved wood, believed to protect against bad luck and restless ghosts. One particularly superstitious courier refused to ride on certain nights unless he had a wolf's tooth tied to his saddle. The connection between the living and the dead was woven tightly into the courier's world. Many riders believed that the spirits of fallen messengers guided the winds and cleared the paths. Ignoring these beliefs was considered reckless, if not downright dangerous. There are also accounts of phantom riders seen charging along deserted roads, sometimes guiding lost travelers to safety, sometimes racing to nowhere. Some scholars suggest these could have been real riders who lost their way or died. Their bodies never found, their stories turned into ghostly lore. Even the design of relay stations reflected these fears. Some were built with protective symbols carved into doorways or with small shrines to honor the spirits of horses and riders. Others had stories carved into walls warning against disrespecting the Yam. This blend of myth and reality shaped the culture of the postal system. It was a world where the line between the material and the spiritual blurred, a place where messages weren't just carried across land, but across worlds. As you ride through this twilight realm, you feel the weight of those stories, the whispered warnings, the flickering shadows. You glance behind you, half expecting to see a ghostly rider matching your pace. But there's only the wind sighing through the grasses, and your own steady heartbeat echoing the rhythm of 1,000 forgotten hooves. As dawn breaks, the horizon stretches endlessly before you, a golden ribbon winding through hills, rivers, and ancient ruins. You're riding one of the farthest western routes of the Yam, pushing past the edges of what was once the Mongol Empire, and into territories where even today the maps blur and legends begin. This is the paper trail to the end of the world. Mongol couriers carried messages farther than almost anyone imagined. From the imperial capitals of Karakorum and Dadu, the Yam stretched westward into the Caucasus, Persia, the steppes of Russia, and even as far as Eastern Europe. The exact limits of these routes are still debated. Some historians argue the system reached the gates of Vienna and the shores of the Black Sea. Others believe it stopped short, limited by geography and political control. You ride past ruined fortresses, their stones worn by time and battle. You cross rivers once marked by hastily built bridges, many now lost beneath silt. Each mile pushes you closer to the edge, not just of the empire, but of known civilization. The western routes were especially tricky. Unlike the vast open steppe, this land was patchworked with forests, mountains, and hostile neighbors. Stations were fewer and farther between. Horses were less reliable, and local populations were often wary or outright hostile. Yet the Yam pressed on. Letters flew over these lands carrying orders to distant governors, trade permits for caravans, and diplomatic overtures to European kings. The reach of the Mongol postal system was as much a statement of power as a practical necessity. One famous story involves a courier who reportedly delivered a message from the Yuan court in China to the Polish prince in just over 2 months, a staggering feat for the time. That letter sealed a diplomatic alliance that shaped the politics of the region for decades. Historians still debate whether these routes were permanent or ad hoc. Some suggest that Western relay stations were seasonal, only operating during times of military campaigns or diplomatic missions. Others believe a skeleton network remained active for decades, albeit with diminishing reliability. Maps from the period are frustratingly vague. Some show dotted lines stretching toward the west, but there's no consensus on exactly where the Yam ended. Did it touch the Mediterranean? Did it cross into the Holy Roman Empire? These questions remain open, with scholars piecing together clues from scattered records and traveler accounts. What is clear is that the symbolism of reach mattered as much as reality. Mongol rulers boasted of their empire spanning from the rising sun to the setting sun, and the postal system was the thread stitching this vast tapestry together. You glance at the worn edges of your scroll and feel the weight of that ambition. You're a rider on the border of history and legend, carrying messages not just between people, but between worlds. The station ahead looms a wooden outpost perched on a hill. Beyond it, unknown lands beckon. You spur your horse forward, chasing the horizon, chasing the end of the world. The cold bites harder as you crest a hill, the ground beneath your horse crunching with early frost. The sky is a dull gray, the sun a pale disk behind heavy clouds. Out here on the far edges of the empire, the climate turns cruel, indifferent, and utterly unforgiving. Welcome to the harsh realities of climate steppe and frozen letters. The Mongol Empire stretched across a vast range of environments, from the deserts of Central Asia to the Siberian taiga. Each region posed unique challenges to the Yam. Riders faced blistering heat, biting cold floods, snowdrifts, and sudden storms. Maintaining a reliable postal route across this patchwork of extremes was a feat of both logistics and stubborn human will. Winter especially was the enemy. Snow could pile up to waist-height, hiding paths and destroying fodder supplies. Frozen rivers were both boon and bane. They allowed for faster crossing in some places, but could crack under the weight of horses. Riders had to learn to read the land like a living map, watching for signs of danger invisible to the untrained eye. One famous incident describes a courier trapped in a blizzard on the Altai Mountains, forced to dig a snow cave and survive on frozen horse meat for 3 days before resuming his journey. His letter delivered late, yes, but alive. Historians still argue about how much the Mongols adapted their routes seasonally. Some believe entire segments of the Yam were closed during the worst months, while others suggest couriers rode year-round swapping horses and delaying messages as needed. The truth likely varies by region. In wetter climates, floods could wash away bridges and roads. One relay station near the Amu Darya River was reportedly flooded so badly that couriers had to swim their horses across, sometimes losing mail in the process. Letters wrapped in oilcloth were still vulnerable to water damage, turning ink into a blurred mystery. There are reports of frozen letters, scrolls stiff and brittle from the cold, sometimes cracking open mid-ride. Some couriers learned to warm the documents near their bodies to prevent damage, but even then the elements were relentless. And then there's the steppe itself, wide, flat, and unforgiving. Sudden sandstorms could blind riders, and the monotony of the landscape sometimes caused riders to lose their way. Survival here wasn't just about speed. It was about endurance, knowledge, and a bit of luck. You press your hands against the reins, feeling the chills seep through your gloves. The breath of your horse steams in the air, a fragile cloud in the cold morning. Despite the hardships, the yam persisted. Stations built with thick walls, roofs designed to shed snow, and stores of preserved fodder helped riders through the worst. In some places, riders were accompanied by guides familiar with local hazards. You glance down at the letter in your saddlebag, its leather pouch worn, but intact. It has survived storms, frost, and the bite of time. And so do you. The road ahead is long, cold, and uncertain. But as you spur your horse forward, you know this is the pulse of an empire, a fragile, stubborn pulse that refuses to fade. The path narrows as you approach a small settlement nestled between hills. Smoke curls lazily from chimneys and the faint clatter of daily life reaches your ears. For a moment you imagine warmth, fresh bread, a soft bed, perhaps even company that doesn't smell of horse sweat. Then you remember this is the yam. Comfort is a luxury. Duty is everything. Now a curious question haunts many historians: did women ever ride the yam routes? Were they couriers, riders, or messengers? The records are tantalizingly vague. There are scattered whispers, fragments of tales passed down through oral histories, and rare documents suggesting that at least some women rode these relay routes. Perhaps as replacements during wartime, or in remote regions where every hand was needed. One Mongol epic mentions a female messenger known for her speed and cunning, though scholars debate whether she was real or myth. Another account tells of a woman from the eastern steppes who reportedly disguised herself as a man to deliver a vital message during a siege. She is said to have ridden through enemy lines and returned with news that saved her city. Whether legend or fact, the story captures imaginations. Historians still argue about the role of women in Mongol postal services. Some claim that women managed stations, tended horses, and supported couriers behind the scenes, though rarely did they carry official dispatches. Others suggest that in times of crisis, the lines blurred. One letter from a Yuan official praises a female station keeper for her dedication and skill in managing horses and supplies, hinting that women's involvement may have been more significant than previously thought. The social norms of the time were complex. Mongol culture, while patriarchal in many respects, allowed for considerable female agency, especially compared to neighboring societies. Women rode horses, managed estates, and sometimes led troops. So why not ride the yam? In any case, whether by necessity or choice, the presence of women in the postal system adds a layer of depth to the history. It reminds us that behind every official seal and stamped letter, there were human lives, diverse, complicated, and often unseen. As you ride past the village, you imagine one such rider, a woman perhaps waiting at a station, sharpening her blade, ready to mount and race across the steppe. The wind catches her cloak and she vanishes into the dawn. You adjust your grip on the reins and press forward. The road calls and you answer just like her. The wind shifts again, carrying a mix of dust and distant rain. You pull your cloak tighter, feeling the weight of the letter in your satchel and the unspoken pressure of the route ahead. If you were to rebuild the yam from scratch, where would you even start? This thought strikes you not as a courier, but as a would-be logistics czar charged with reviving one of history's greatest communication networks. First, you'd need the basics: a clear map of stations, a reliable roster of horses, and a network of riders trained not just to gallop, but to navigate, negotiate, and endure. You'd want a system flexible enough to handle deserts and mountains, winter snows and summer storms. Next, you'd tackle supply chains, making sure each station had enough fodder, food, and shelter to keep riders moving. You'd negotiate with local communities, balancing their needs with the demands of the empire. Corruption would be your enemy, but so would bureaucracy. Communication would be key, not just the messages you carry, but the feedback from stations and riders. You'd establish a network of inspectors and auditors to ensure quality, but you'd want to avoid turning them into the empire's grumpy bureaucrats, lest morale plummet. Technology might help. You'd invest in better saddles, weatherproof containers for letters, and perhaps early forms of signaling, flags, fires, or even carrier pigeons for short hops. You'd standardize measurements, introduce training programs, and maybe even record courier routes to prevent riders from getting lost. But above all, you'd need trust. Trust between riders and stations, between local communities and the empire. The system could only survive if everyone saw themselves as part of a greater whole, rather than mere cogs in a dusty machine. Historians still debate how close the Mongols came to this ideal. The reality was messy, full of grit, sweat, and occasional betrayal. Yet the Yam endured longer than most medieval institutions, because it was built on the will to connect. Imagine yourself standing at a relay station watching riders arrive and depart like threads weaving a living tapestry. The letters you carry aren't just ink on paper, they're the voice of a continent, the breath of an empire. Your job isn't easy. It never was. But if you can keep the system running, if you can keep the horses fed and the messages moving, you're doing something remarkable. Because in a world without internet, without phones, without instant communication, you are the network. And the world waits for your next ride. Dusk falls with a hush, painting the world in shades of indigo and silver. The road is quiet, so quiet that you can hear your horse's breath, the rustle of grass, the faint crackle of a letter's seal against your chest. Sometimes amid all the miles and the triumphs, a message simply doesn't make it. Tonight you carry the story of the final letter never delivered. Not every message entrusted to the Yam reached its recipient. The steppe is vast, accidents are many, and the empire's arteries have always been fragile. Lost letters became almost mythical, tiny tragedies that flickered briefly in the grand story of conquest. There's a tale of a courier riding through a sudden snowstorm, visibility vanishing in an instant. He pressed on, stubborn and loyal, but neither he nor his horse were ever seen again. Months later, after the spring melt, herders found a leather satchel caught in a tree branch beside a half-frozen stream. Inside a letter, its writing blurred but still legible, addressed to a governor who had since died. Historians still debate what the letter contained. Some say it was a warning about a looming rebellion. Others believe it was a message of forgiveness meant to spare a condemned official. A few romantic souls whisper that it was a poem sent from a lover far away. We'll never know. The only certainty is that a letter full of someone's hope or fear never found its way home. You wonder as you ride into the gloom how many messages vanished this way, swallowed by weather, lost to war, or simply misplaced by tired hands. Each one is a mystery sealed in silence, a story that never got to be told. And yet for every letter lost, thousands more made it. For every silence, a chorus of voices crossed the continent. The Yam was never perfect, but it was persistent, a living system shaped by the hands and hooves of its riders. You pull your own letter from your pouch, tracing the wax seal with your thumb. You vow not to let it join the ranks of the undelivered. Not tonight. A flock of cranes passes overhead, their wings flashing against the darkening sky. The last station is near. You ride on, determined, carrying your message toward whatever awaits, knowing that in this moment, you're not just a courier, but the keeper of a fragile thread that binds worlds. Some messages never arrive. but yours will. The world fades to twilight as you approach the last outpost, a lonely hut perched atop a rise, its windows glowing warm against the growing dark. Your horse legs trembling but faithful, carries you the final steps up the hill. The air is thick with memory, dust, sweat, and the soft echo of hoofbeats long gone. You dismount, stretching aching muscles, feeling every mile of the journey behind you. This station, like so many before, it has weathered centuries of footsteps, riders, station keepers, horses, even a few lost diplomats, all passing through its humble doorway. Inside, you hand off your letter to the night watchman, whose hands are stained with ink and soot. He nods, accepts the message, and tucks it carefully into a battered wooden chest. For a moment you linger in the warmth, a bowl of broth, a place by the fire, the gentle hum of quiet voices. Outside, the last glow of sunset bleeds into a sky scattered with stars. You stand in the doorway, breathing deep the cool, dry air. In the distance, you can just make out the soft drum of hooves, echoes of all who came before you, all who carried letters, dreams, warnings, and hopes across this continent. As the Mongol Empire wanes, the Yam too grows silent. Fewer messages pass. More stations are abandoned. Yet in the dust and darkness, you sense the living heartbeat of a system that once stitched together half the known world. The trails remain, sometimes faint, sometimes bold, threading through memory and legend. Historians will debate the fate of the last route. Some say the echoes faded into nothing. Others insist you can still hear ghostly riders galloping through the night, messages tucked close, delivering news to the very edge of the world. You settle in for the night, firelight flickering gently. The empire slumbers, but for a moment longer, you listen, ears straining for those final hoofbeats, the echo of a message faithfully carried across impossible miles. And then at last, you let yourself drift towards sleep, knowing the journey, yours and theirs, continues somewhere, somehow, in the quiet twilight of history. Now the journey is over and the world grows softer, edges blurring distances, fading, the echoes of hooves dissolving into the hush of the steppe at night. Breathe deeply and let your shoulders relax. Picture yourself wrapped in a heavy cloak, warm and safe within the shelter of an old relay station. The fire crackling softly, shadows flickering along the walls. The long road lies behind you, each mile a quiet memory, each message a story safely delivered or gently surrendered to time. Outside, the wind sighs through empty fields, stirring the tall grasses and carrying with it the faintest whispers of journeys past. Horses graze quietly nearby, and every sound is slow, soft, and familiar. A cup set down, a page turning, the creak of wooden beams. Above you, the stars emerge one by one, calm and steady, shining over the endless expanse of steppe. With each breath, let the tension of travel melt away. Let the glow of the hearth soothe your tired muscles, and the gentle rhythm of imagined hoofbeats lull you toward rest. In the vast quiet, know that you are part of a greater story, that your journey, like the paths of the Yam, has meaning, even in silence. Close your eyes. Listen to the soft, steady beat of history's heart. Let yourself sink into sleep, carried on the wind and the memory of all who came before you. The road is at peace. The world is at rest. Sweet dreams.